and I couldn't have done it better. Public consultations as a process are also deeply embedded in our work as Civis. A few lines about us. Civis is an independent not-for-profit that facilitates public consultations between citizens and government bodies in India. Our goal is to make both giving feedback as a citizen and receiving feedback as a government as frictionless as possible. For this, we at Civis harness the power of technology to aid governments in this endeavor that helps further evidence-backed policy and lawmaking. While our work primarily focuses on facilitating these consultations, our thought that I shared earlier continued to be a part of a lot of discussions at our workplace. What does it mean to conduct these public consultations well? And are there examples of this standard amongst us? We delved deeper into this question, and the answer was a resounding yes. Through almost 7 years of Civis's work, we found that government bodies in India were constantly pushing the boundaries with their work on participative lawmaking, and we believed that recognizing and showcasing this work would be of utmost importance. And thus, the Civis Public Consultation Awards were born. The inaugural edition of these awards was celebrated to coincide with a very special moment for public consultations in India. It marked a decade of the extensively crafted pre-legislative consultation policy, or PLCP for short, which was passed by the Ministry of Law and Justice in 2014. This document has incentivized several government ministries to undertake consultations and adopt its directives voluntarily. Today, Civis's Public Consultation Awards 2025 is in its second edition, and it continues this vision: recognize and commend government champions for their commitment to citizen and government engagement. This edition of the awards could not have been made possible without support from our partners. We are deeply grateful to Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies, also Louis and Fiona Miranda, who are supporting us on behalf of the Indian School of Public Policy, along with Sri Vinay Toshniwal Memorial Trust. With their support, the awards have become more than a platform of recognition, but also an exercise in engagement and dialogue on participatory governance. In this vein, we begin the evening with insights from a luminary in the field of public administration, who has pushed the boundaries across administrative and regulatory landscapes, Dr. K.P. Krishnan. Dr. K.P. Krishnan has served in the Indian Administrative Services for 37 years, holding key positions in the Government of Karnataka, Government of India, as well as the World Bank. In Karnataka, he worked in agriculture, urban development, commercial taxes, and finance, including working as the district collector of Mangalore. At the national level, he served as Secretary, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, from which he retired in 2019. He was also the Additional Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, and Secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He has been on several corporate, regulatory, as well as non-profit boards, shaping our economic and financial policy. He holds a master's and a PhD in economics from IIM Bangalore. And alongside his government career, he has had a strong academic backing, where he serves as visiting faculty at IIM Bangalore, ISB, and the Ashoka University. He held the prestigious Bock Visiting Professorship of Regulation at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the IEPF Chair Professor of Economics at the NCAER, New Delhi. He is currently an Honorary Senior Fellow at the ICPP Ashoka University. With extensive experience in governance, policy, and academia, Dr. Krishnan brings a wealth of knowledge to this evening. We are honored to welcome him as our keynote speaker. I would like to request Dr. Krishnan to kindly grace the dais.
Thank you very much, Malika. Very good evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to reconnect with many long-standing friends and colleagues. I'm truly happy to be here at the second edition of the Civis Public Consultation Awards function. As the invitation says, this is an occasion to bring together luminaries of public administration to shed light on good governance and create an environment of discourse on better participatory policy making. I want to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I intend over the next 15-20 minutes or so to essentially share my thoughts on something narrower than participation. It's focusing on India's emerging or perhaps emerged regulatory state, public consultation in the context of the regulatory state to enhance legitimacy. That's broadly what I'll be speaking about. Given my background, given my experience, and given my knowledge, perhaps I'll speak a lot more on the regulatory state and make the case for consultation, and hoping that experts like Antara and others who are here, who know the nuances and the methodology and all of the steps of consultation much better than I, that they would add thoughts to what I'm saying and hopefully complete the full picture. Now, with this quick background, we use this word regulation in a conversational sense, in our sort of daily lives. How much do we as individuals know about the purity and safety of the ingredients that go into making medicines that we consume? Or about safekeeping of the money that we hand over to a mutual fund or to a pension fund provider regulated by Deepak and his team in PFRDA, or to an insurance company to cover a contingency that may occur, which all of us deal with in our sort of first lessons in microeconomics, called information asymmetry. Inherently, the provider of this service or the provider or the supplier of this good knows more than us as consumers about what he or she is making or supplying to us. Now, given this, it would be very unreasonable to expect us as individuals to buy a strip of paracetamol, pick one of the 10 tablets at random, give it to a private lab, and get it tested for purity. It's not something which is very practical. Equally, it would be unreasonable to ask grandmothers and dentists to go and figure out the safety and soundness of a bank. The use of the coercive power of the state to address these problems is the subject of regulation. And as consumers, as citizens, we are much more confident of buying these when a regulator has helped reduce the information asymmetry which is inherent, as I said, in some of these products. I go pick up a paracetamol in the confident belief that the drug regulator has permitted that this be sold. Likewise, I go and open an account and deposit money in a bank in the confident belief that the Reserve Bank of India has permitted this bank to operate. Done well, regulation is about addressing these particular types of market failures. I took the example of reduction of asymmetry of information, improving competition in markets, and addressing negative externalities, to quote the jargon, are typically three areas where regulators operate. Here I want to introduce a slight distinction between the word regulation and the notion of a regulator. Regulation could well be done by a department of the government. For example, the most sort of, in one sense, the mother of all regulators is the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, the registrar of companies, and that whole hierarchy which finally sort of concludes at the level of the Minister for Corporate Affairs is the regulator for companies, and that's a regulator which sits inside the government department. Likewise, in India, the regulator of pharmaceuticals is an agency called the Central Drugs Standards Control Organization, which is a unit housed within the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. On the other hand, regulator could be a separate legal entity, sort of again, quote sort of jargon, it's a stand-alone entity with its own governing board, its own staff, its own executive management, created by a legislation. PFRDA, which Dr. Mohanty heads, will be here in the panel soon, is one such regulator, created by an act of parliament, a distinct legal body, in law, separate from the Ministry of Finance, which for a lot of purposes in the Act may be government for PFRDA, but legally distinct and separate entities. I prefer to use the word statutory regulatory authority for all such bodies. It's self-explanatory. Statutory, created by law; regulatory, because they exercise this power of regulation; authority, because they are a stand-alone, legally separate entity. For the rest of the lecture, I sort of use regulator, SRA, or regulation interchangeably, but you sort of get the idea. I want to spend a few minutes on the rise of this category, which till about 1991, India did not know. We didn't know this notion of an SRA. We actually see the emergence of the first real SRA in India in 1992 with the creation of the Securities Exchange Board of India. And since then, it has been a relentless sort of rise of SRAs in India. It is now, my last count, union, just at the union level, we perhaps have a little over 24, 25 at least, statutory regulatory authorities. The Data Protection Board, which was the sort of last of the creations, very recent creation, though I guess a lot of scholars would call it an apology for a regulator in terms of the actual powers that have been given to the board, but formally it is created by a statute with regulatory powers, and it has some legal personality in terms of being a distinct body. With that, we are at something like 24, 25 legal bodies created by parliamentary legislation with powers of regulation. This wave of regulators is a conceptual leap. A lot of us here would not be aware of the pre-91 India, but there are some of us who've lived in that India. From the era of central planning to specialized agencies that can effectively manage modern markets using apolitical, expert-driven decision-making is a serious conceptual leap which many of us have seen and lived through. What we need to understand is that regulation, so defined, is inherently heavy-handed. It is in its nature that it is heavy-handed, and let me just spend a few minutes explaining what appears to be basic, but the nuances are well worth spending a few minutes on. The basic argument for a statutory regulatory authority is that addressing these specific types of market failures that I alluded to earlier requires domain expertise. It requires distance from politics. Very often, it requires decisions that need to be speedy, that need to be immediate, and an ability to develop and respond to actually to respond to fast-paced happenings, developments in the sector, whether it's data protection, whether it's Reserve Bank of India, whether it's markets. Very often the response time may be very short, in addition to all of the other complications that I mentioned. It requires expertise and it requires distance from politics. Now, these are not easy to obtain within a government department, and that is the argument for arm's length bodies, distinct and separate from the government department. Now, inherent in this design is the requirement of empowerment. And given the very nature, if you're talking about mergers and acquisitions, if you're talking about food safety, if you're talking about safety of medicines, given the very nature of this subject, the parliamentary legislation on this subject will necessarily be skeletal. It will essentially say, SEBI may or SEBI shall, by regulation, regulate. And there is a list of 28 or 29 items in that famous section of the SEBI Act, which says the SEBI will, by regulation, regulate the following activities. And similar sections we will find in a lot of the other legislations. Essentially, what the parliamentary law does is to create a framework, empower the regulator to make regulations, and it will now be obvious that if the nature of the subject matter is technical and it requires expertise, so does implementation ability. So, the power to implement the regulations made by the regulator is vested with the regulator. Most countries, vis-a-vis most agencies, stopped here. In the case of India, in the case of many regulators, we've gone beyond these two powers, and we've actually empowered these regulators to also be the adjudicator of disputes arising between the regulated entity and the regulator on regulations made by the regulator and implemented by the regulator. I want you to spend 1 minute to let this sink in. It sounds like one of those semi-crazy astrological YouTube videos. It's the regulator who is writing the regulation, implementing them, and sitting very often on judgment on violations of these regulations by the regulated entities. Now, it will be argued that this is essential. It is not so in all of the rest of the world, but we'll take this to be given because this is the situation in India. With this, we now need to worry about this whole notion which my colleague Mr. Sahu very briefly mentioned in that introduction that he made. We are talking about the legitimacy of law, binding rules of conduct made by unelected officials which have consequences, including penal consequences, including the ability to suspend your right to trade. In other words, a lot of Article 19 rights, as well as a bunch of other statutory rights. So here is the situation where unelected officials are making binding rules of conduct. And what is the mechanism that most countries devised, and what did India devise? We devised a mechanism of post facto placement of regulations before parliamentary committees to enable committees to look at them and post facto give their comments. What is the record? We have two committees, Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha committees on subordinate legislation, put together. The numbers that I've crunched show me that in the period 99 to 2022, the parliamentary committees reviewed 1717 regulations by all SRAs in India. Why is this number, or what is the significance of this number? Just one regulator, SEBI, has made, hold your breath, 661 regulations. This is one regulator. And India has 25 regulators as we stand now. Out of these, the parliamentary committees have reviewed 17 regulations. In other words, the absence of legitimacy or presence of democratic deficit in administrative law made by regulators is complete. They are seriously deficient in what we would call democracy or legitimacy. I'm not getting into the judicial deference part. I'm not getting into other aspects which could potentially be correctives, but I want to just draw home years and endless shouting by a lot of academics, a lot of researchers, and it's a good effort. It could be better, but at least there is a beginning. CIVI, to be fair to them, has been doing consultations in the past. It could be done much better. It could be much more formalized and streamlined. But the two methods which typically you see in the literature to handle this problem are A, public consultation, and investing in the regulators, the expertise and the capacity with sophisticated documents to show cost-benefit analysis. Why are you doing what you're doing is the whole essence of participatory consultation. And I think the nuances of how this is to be done is perhaps much better understood by a lot of the audience than I. All I want to draw is to draw your attention to this larger problem of the democratic legitimacy deficit. And I want to sort of conclude by pointing out that this is not some distant academic researcher's worry. This has serious consequences, which at another opportunity one will be able to document. I write in the public domain about this. This has positive consequences in the form of good medicines that we eat, but it has an enormous amount of negative consequences which are not adequately costed and commented upon. So the need for the legitimacy and the closing of this deficit is not just a theoretical plea flowing out of political theory or political science, it's something flowing out of practical consequences. So it is in this context that the two solutions that I'm talking about, consultation plus expertise, which Antara and her team do for the entire state machinery, going beyond just the regulatory apparatus that I'm talking about, that Civis does on scale, which I'd like to commend. It is truly valuable work, and on behalf of, I think, citizens of India and on behalf of researchers like me, I want to thank you. And please continue the good work. Yesterday, I think it was Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav, the Union Minister, speaking at the 3rd Indian Express Excellence in Governance Awards, according to the newspapers, said, governance is the ability to develop trust between government and society. Public consultation builds this trust. Best wishes to the awardees and more power to the awardees, Antara and her very competent team in Civis for the wonderful work that you're doing. More power to you and more work to enhance this public trust. Thank you very much for this opportunity.